Okay, so thank you everyone for making it. So I was running between two meetings, and as a result, I was a slow starter, but here we are now. And today I was reminded that it is 75 years since the Windrush sailed and came to the shores of this country. And I know a few locations, they'll be having events to mark the day. And where I am in Milton Keynes, I know there'll be some event at MK Rose. I think it is between 6 and 8 p.m. So, and I'm hoping to go and attend. So today's session, as you would have seen on Eventbrite, is asking questions, but also sharing some ideas of how we can, as a society, we can take racial equity seriously. So the trigger, obviously, there are many reasons why this is an issue, and we will try and set the scene. And I have, alongside myself, we have two speakers who will be sharing their insights. And what I'll be doing, because we can't, introductions can take a long time. So what we'll do is we'll try and, post the bios which you got in the invite. We'll post them on, we'll post them in the chat. So I won't be reading everybody's bio. I know it is short, but suffice to say that we have got Charlotte, who is coming for a second time to CVSL event. I think when we met that a while back, at the time she was working for Cardiff Council, and we have met virtually, but eventually in person as well last December. And today, so she has moved on now. She's working for South Wales Police and Crime Commissioner. I think she'll be telling us more about it. And then Amajit is somebody I Googled, and so I don't even know how we met, but I think there was an introduction. Is doing some very interesting work through the Black Leadership Group, and he will, I'm very sure, be telling us more, and we will be unmuting him and allowing him to switch on his camera when he comes on. And then you have myself, who is your host. Just a few ground rules. Obviously, we are on we are meeting virtually. The meeting is being recorded. Obviously, if and because your cameras are switched off and your mics are off, so it's unlikely you'll be if you want to change the name on the screen, that's the only thing we record. You can change it and go incognito. But other than that, we will not be obviously be filming and taking people's images without their consent. And that's the reason why we have done what we are doing. So then, obviously, we have we'll be encouraging people to put their questions in the question and answers box. And if at all we have no questions, we may have to unmute people if they want to ask questions anyway. But by then, we may have to stop recording, but we are not there yet. So what I thought I would do is maybe to set the scenes and say why we are here. Yes, thank you, Amajit, for coming. I see you now. You have joined us formally. Set the scenes, locate the work we have been doing at the Open University, which explains our interest in what we are doing, and in actual fact, spell out what we are doing, because it's not good enough to be complaining about things without doing anything about them. So I will try now and see if I can share my my slides. If I can't, we have a backup plan. Webinar slide, yes. Okay, so it should be coming. Yes, we are there. We are there. Okay, so I hope you can see the screen. Yeah, okay, so I can see some thumbs up. It means we are there. So let me start by actually quoting one of my heroes, the late Desmond Tutu. I had the pleasure of meeting him in 2005. So he said something very profound, which is, if you see a problem, look at its source. Don't just focus on the symptoms. I know what you'll be talking about because I'm about to share some statistics which I'm not going to read, just to highlight why racial equity should be our problem, should be our issue, not mine, ours. I'm not using I. I'm saying it should be our problem as a society. And obviously, we need to go out and find out why, rather than just looking at the symptom, because if we treat only the symptoms, we are not going to deal with the cause. So, oh no, it's not doing what I'm hoping to do. Okay, that's fine. Sorry. Some glitch now. I see I can only move slides in a certain way. So I did a bit of work in terms of going out to look at the statistics, and I'll be sharing them. I'm not even going to read. I just put them there. You have a look, and then I move to the next one. So this one here is about politics and government, the representation. So I also looked at the overrepresentation of racialized minorities in our prisons. I looked at the area of homelessness, just I'm sharing. Those are things, most of them even from government sources. So just to highlight why we need to think about it and we need to do something about it. I have looked at employment and unemployment. So you have your figures there. So compared to some, the figures for ethnic minorities are, in terms of unemployment, are higher. So in terms of income, so there you are. So those are the income figures. Again, as I said, I'm imparting too much information. And by the way, obviously, you can go back and revisit the presentation. You'll be able to read what I'm sharing in your own time. Okay. So, yeah, so I need to do it that way. Okay. So we also looked at people who are in care. So you have the statistics just for you can have a look, and then you realize that in sort of in comparative terms, the number of children of ethnic minority background in care are higher than the average. Okay, so then we're looking at the sort of what happens when people go to universities and graduate, in terms of the kind of jobs they get, in terms of how much time it takes them to have mobility. So there are gaps across the board. So then I'll probably focus on these last two slides in terms of statistics. Because when COVID, for me, was an eye-opener, and it triggered the work I'm going to talk about, what the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership has been doing. When initially, obviously, issues that might have led to this disproportionate impact of COVID on ethnic minorities. Initially, they spoke about vitamin D and so forth, but obviously over time now we have realized it is to do with those racial inequalities. That means some people in some communities are more likely to get infected by COVID, likely to die from COVID, even considering the comorbidities, just in case, because those were issues which were being mentioned. So obviously the explanation of some of the explanation didn't hold. Okay, and finally, obviously, one of the issues which come up all the time is stop and search. And I've included this one here because during the Black Lives Matter protest, issues around stop and search came up very strongly, and it is an issue which we read in the press all the time. And as you can see then, if you are sort of, Black, you are 52.6 of every 1,000 Black people are stopped, compared to 7.5 of the white cohort. So those are some of the indicators as to why we need to do something. So now, what can we do and what have we done? So in 2020, along with my colleagues, I'll be sharing their names very shortly, we noted the issues I have mentioned, and then we had obviously COVID, we had Black Lives Matter, and we wondered, what can we do? How can we step in as an institution? What can we do to make a difference? So then what we did, that's the research team, one or two, I don't know if are on the call, but others may not, but it's not only me. Today I'm the face, but there are other people behind what we are doing, and there are even more than those ones I have mentioned on the slides. So what we have been doing has evolved a number of projects. So we started with exploring how Black and ethnic minority leaders are collaborating and engaging with policymakers to address racial inequalities. So that was the initial project. And then the following phase, we looked at specifically the police to look at how they could sort of expand the pool of Black and ethnic minorities they are engaging with. And then subsequently, we got some resources to do some work where we are looking at racialized minorities, minority gatekeepers, which I'll be coming back to at some stage. Yeah, and then we have also commissioned a literature review on how to reach Black and ethnic minorities and their participation and representation. So in terms of literature review, so we have the one on how to reach, but subsequently, I have been doing some work where I have been looking at myself as one of those racialized minority leaders, and then try to figure out what lessons have I drawn from my experience over the last 3 to 4 years. So more and more, I have been doing some research on gatekeeping, and I'll be coming back to it. I have also been looking at the white allyship, and how in effect this white allyship happens in real life in the context of I have shared. In terms of hard to reach, which was the idea given at the time when we said, okay, so which groups are you engaging with and whom are you not engaging with? So some of our respondents started telling us, okay, so some people are hard to reach and so forth. So that's why we commissioned a piece of research. And as you can see on the 4th bullet point, no one is hard to reach, just more expensive to reach. So, or expensive, or maybe you are not making enough effort. And in fact, when you say somebody is hard to reach, you know they exist. It's probably a problem with you. It's not with the people whom you claim they are hard to reach. Then, in terms of gatekeepers, this was an area which clearly I needed to look into. We needed to look into, because those service providers I alluded to, very clearly they were out there engaging with people from Black and ethnic minorities. But the question was, which individuals were they engaging with? Were those individuals representative, or were they not representative? So that's why I've been trying to dig and try to find out more about the behavior or attitude of some of those gatekeepers, and whether or not, and asking myself whether or not those gatekeepers can also be a problem. So the final bit in terms of literature is one on allyship, and very clearly there is a difference between somebody who is just doing it for the sake of it, i.e. performative, which we know through tokenism, where we just go and get a few people and have a few people of color around the table, and then we say we are very inclusive. But there is also going beyond and engaging in a more authentic and in a more substantive way. So those are some of the areas we are trying to unpack and understand what is going on, because it's very clearly the whole idea of lack of representation. You can't just say it is to do with people not being accessible because people are hard to reach. Very clearly, we need to look beyond that, and maybe the answer is in the gatekeeping. Maybe the answer is in the kind of white allies we have in those organizations. So in terms of what we have done, as you can see on the screen, we have done semi-structured interviews, we have done focus groups, and the last piece of the jigsaw was the knowledge exchange activity roundtables, which we hosted in Milton Keynes as well as in Swansea, Newport, and Cardiff. And then we had a dissemination conference in Cardiff in December, as I alluded to earlier. So the work we have not yet started to analyze it fully, but the emerging themes are around the whole notion of community, which it's difficult to define. How to define it? Is it by geography? Is it by identity? Is it by interest? Is it a digital community? Because now we have got friends who we happen to know on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so forth. Is that our community? And then we are also looking at the networks we are part of, the whole idea of social political capital. We have been looking at the volunteers and professionals in the voluntary sector. We have also been looking at the whole idea of trust and emotions, which whenever you talk about race comes up. And we have been looking at systems, and we have been asking ourselves whether or not the structures we have are fit to allow for this inclusion we are all trying to achieve, as well as obviously the racial equity, which is the primary motivation. So identity and racism, as you would imagine, those things will come up. I'm conscious of the time, so sorry for sharing too much information, but I believe it is very important we do it, because I'm setting the scene for what you are going to hear from Charlotte and Amajit. So we have done some some more work in terms of who is engaged and who is not engaged, and we have identified a number of subgroups within those who are engaged. So those are the ones who are visible, the people you see everywhere, faith leaders. Unfortunately, the people of the racial minorities who are engaged, they tend to be male dominantly and a particular age. So we don't see many young people. And you recall that when we had the Black Lives Matter protests, for example, there was a conflict between the existing leaders and the new leaders who emerged during the Black Lives Matter. So in terms of the those who are less engaged, so those are the words, the names people gave themselves, or they attributed to the kind of how they felt. Some people felt they were seldom heard, others felt they were seldom asked, others were not yet engaged. The seldom heard being the ones who go to meetings but are never given the opportunity to speak, and even when they speak, they are not taken seriously. Seldom asked are the ones who are not invited, although they exist and they are doing a lot of work. And the not yet engaged are the people who are not yet engaged, if you see what I mean. So in terms of the gatekeepers, I have been doing more work, and I have identified a typology of gatekeepers as well, including those who lift the ladder once they get where they go. They sort of the omnipresent, who want to overshadow everybody, as well as those people who are trying to build bridges between communities and voluntary sector organizations and public institutions. For allyship, I have covered it already. I'm not going to repeat myself. So in terms of implications of what we are doing, from the perspective of hard to reach, I am, we are probably going to be questioning the concept and one asking questions about who actually ascribed the term or labeled people as hard to reach. Does it say more about them, or does it say less about the people they are labeling? So the gatekeeping, I think, will probably be looking at, those professional as well as those informal gatekeepers, what they are doing in terms of helping to deal with inclusion, to deal with racial equity. So then the allyship, we be asking ourselves whether some of those white allies are reactive, performative, or if they are sort of active and are actually working very hard and buying into what people are asking for in order to actually build a more equitable society. So this is my final slide now, then because I've been talking for too long, and if I'm going to be asking Charlotte and Cole to stick to the 20 minutes, I should be the first one to do it. So in terms of practice, we are still looking at the data, but I'm very sure we will be asking those people who are sort of trying to engage with racial minority leadership organizations to go through their own engagement processes, because sometimes it's to do with the kind of people you get, because I have realized that sometimes people go always for the low-hanging fruit. So the person who is available is the one you invite, or you organize meetings, for example, in working hours when the people are trying to have to earn a life somewhere else. They do their voluntary work, so you can't expect them to be there when they are at work to expect them to attend your meetings. And then you wonder why people don't show up, or you wonder why they are not consulting with you, or communicating with emails with people who may not necessarily have him be on the internet, or communicating with them in a language which they don't understand. So the data will tell us, we give us some direction. I'm just giving you some top line things which I think are going to come up. In terms of connecting with racialized minorities themselves, I think there'll be issues around the kind of individuals they engage with. I know, as an example, I heard from Wales when we were in South Wales, whereby they have those independent advisory groups with the police. Now they have an open call for applications, so they don't just go and approach people. So there is a whole process which will allow sort of fluidity rather than always going for the usual suspect who may not necessarily be communicating with you the information you need as a public institution. So we will also be having hopefully something to say about allyship in itself, about the kind of attitude we have, because I've been told the doors are open, but having an open door does not necessarily mean the door is open for me, I can go in. It may be open for some, it may not be open for me. And then obviously, we are hoping we can engage in a dialogue, highlight what is happening, not only in an academic sense, but look at the practical steps we need in order to increase the chances of working towards racial equity. So that's my sort of my presentation, and now we'll move on to our colleagues who are waiting, who have been listening to me. Remember, go to the chat, ask your questions, because we are going to have ample time for question and answers. Now, who is going to go next? Charlotte, do you want to go next? I'll stop sharing.
I'm happy to go next, Fidel, no problem at all. Louise, could I get presenter access so I can share my screen? Is that all right?
Give me 2 seconds, Charlotte.
No worries.
Should be through now.
Thank you very much. Okay. Can everyone see that? Is that in full screen? Brilliant. Okay. Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me today. I am going to talk quite personally in some aspects about my journey. As Fidel mentioned, my work, but I'm not coming at this from necessarily a wholly professional side. I'm coming at this from a personal side in my kind of anti-racist journey. Who am I? Okay. Basically, I can tell you that I'm the strategic lead for scrutiny and inequalities with South Wales Police and Crime Commissioner. I could tell you I've got a master's degree in human rights. I could tell you I've got almost 10 years of community-focused career within the public and third sector. I can tell you I'm a privileged, white, cisgender, queer woman from a working class background. But does any of that matter? Does my education, my employment, my background or lived experience matter in taking race equity seriously? You have to be well educated to be anti-racist. Do you have to be an equalities professional to understand race inequity or to see it? My credentials and my experience could be as long as my arm, but it wouldn't matter, because if I'm not taking personal action to address my own racism, if I'm not listening to and being led by global majority voices, I'm not taking race equity seriously. My point being, it doesn't matter who I am. In the name of inclusivity, race equity cannot be a closed space. Every single one of us can influence change in our circles, even if it's small. Wherever we are, change is in our control, because a drop in the ocean still causes ripples. So, as you may have guessed from my accent or my job title, I am from and based in Wales. We have a very kind of unique context with regards to the wider UK, not only because our devolved nation has had Labour leadership since the Senate's creation, what was the National Assembly, in 1999, but we've got a government that takes social justice seriously, that recognises institutional racism and is taking action to dismantle its hold. This includes the following. So we've got the Anti-Racism Wales Action Plan. If you're interested, this is a substantial document, and including a pledge for Wales to be an anti-racist nation by 2030. We've got the Criminal Justice in Wales Anti-Racism Action Plan. Now, this is interesting because I'm sure you're aware that not all, well, criminal justice bodies generally are not devolved, but all police forces, all police and crime commissioners, or the HMPPS, so prison and probations, courts and tribunals, have all signed this Criminal Justice Anti-Racism Action Plan in order to address inequities within the criminal justice system in Wales. We've also ratified the socioeconomic duty, which is the first duty as part of the Equality Act in 2010. It basically means that all local authorities in Wales have to legislatively give due regard to socioeconomic background of their work. And as we know, there is intersectionality within that status when we're talking about socioeconomic status. We've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is the first of its kind in the world, where policy decisions that are made in the Senedd have to give due regard to future generations. So the impact of the decisions that we are making today lands with our future generations. That includes not just climate change, but inequalities as well. And then we've got something quite special. All of the above comes together in a one public sector approach to inequity, where all public authorities in Wales have agreed to work collaboratively, cooperatively, co-productively to address inequality and become anti-racist. This is connected to the Anti-Racist Action Plan, but I wanted to highlight it because you can't achieve this alone. So just wanted to highlight that as well. So if you are more interested finding out about any of these works, I can provide links to share. But I just wanted to provide that broader context of what I'm working in Wales and, you know, Wales represent. So I'm going to talk about order of change for a moment. Targets, cultural change and personal agency. You may have seen this before. But I think it's really important when we're talking about taking race equity seriously. So targets, as we know, very important. There needs to be a focus for organisation. We need to set targets in our strategies. They need to be smart, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. For example, we will have a representative workforce for the communities we serve, with 21% of our workforce being from a racially minoritized background by 2025. Great, you've got that goal. Secondly, cultural change. That's the behaviours of your workplace. Are you showcasing how seriously you're taking this work as an organisation? Do you offer reverse mentoring programmes? Is your EDI strategy just gathering dust on a virtual shelf, or is it out and active and threaded into all aspects of the business? So I think the first two, most organisations and leaders are generally on board with. We're thinking about these things and getting them right in some areas. But I'm not convinced, and I certainly wasn't with kind of in my own space, that leaders have thought actively about that third element in the order of change as an organisation. Personal agency. Are you creating capacity and space within your organisation for people to learn? Let's look at the individual. Let's look at you. So you've got your targets, you've got a robust EDI strategy, but are you doing the work personally? Are you dismantling your own bias, your own racism? Are you reading the books, having the difficult conversations, sitting in the uncomfortable? Because change doesn't happen when we're sitting comfortably, and your discomfort isn't anything compared to the trauma faced every single day by individuals from racially minoritized backgrounds, the global majority. So the premise of number 3 is ultimately ignoring the bigger picture for a second. What is in your control to achieve? What are you doing on this journey, and where do you want to be? Because you going on your own anti-racism journey will ultimately bring others with you, who will bring others with them, who will bring others with them. Then we get back to the bigger picture. I'm not living in this dream world. I know that this takes work. Wales will not be an anti-racist nation by 2030 if we're just focusing on targets and EDI strategy. We need personal agency. But this, and I might get emotional, this is an overwhelming space. As I said, this is an emotional space. This is a passionate space. This is a bone-aching space. This is heart-wrenching and beyond hard work. This isn't an area where we can switch off. If you're in this fight, it's 24/7, and that is exhausting. Burnout, frustration, overwhelm are rampant realities in social justice and educational equity organisations, sectors, and movements at large. You might feel like you're often tasked with making the impossible possible, trying to do the most with the least. With responsibilities, we shoulder in increasingly complex environments, and it's hard not to feel overwhelmed, stuck, or just helpless, or bloody annoyed sometimes. So I want to look at the sphere of control. The sphere of control is a concept that helps people focus their precious time and energy on things they can control so that they can make a greater impact where it matters the most. So while in most spaces it's regarded as a tool of productivity, it's also a tool of resilience. It's not just about getting things done, it's about recognizing your power. Now, generally speaking, this matters because seeing where we have choices and agency is key to our sense of well-being. But for leaders specifically, creating space for others to exercise their voice, their choice, and agency is part of a trauma-informed approach. So anyone can apply the concept of the sphere of control at work and beyond, but it can be particularly helpful for people with marginalised identities or who have less positional power in their organisations. So use the sphere of control to get unstuck, if that's where you are. Think through the following. Name the situation. What's the situation that's causing your feelings of overwhelm, frustration, helplessness, stuckness, or anger? 2, identify what's outside your sphere of control. Think about what you have no direct control over. This might include things in your political, social, organisational, or personal context, immovable project constraints, budgets, deadlines, etc., and other people's attitudes, behaviours, or feelings. And then identify what's inside your sphere of control. Think about what you can directly control. This can include your mindset or approach, proposals, actions that you can take. The things inside your sphere of control can range from immediate and relatively small to talk to my manager about that situation, to a bigger and more dramatic change like I need to find another job. So consider the full range of options. 4, do one thing in your control. Now, for many people, simply naming what's in their control is enough to feel a sense of power and agency and get out of a rut of helplessness, especially in this space. However, I recommend that you go one step further and take action on one thing that you have control over. What mindsets, approaches, or values can you apply? What actions can you take? What can you do to prepare or prevent a situation should it happen again? How might you react if and when that situation arises? And what proposals can you make? Further information on the sphere of control can be found online. There's lots of guidance out there. I've used Management Centre for articulation of this point here. But I wouldn't be doing this any justice if I didn't talk about what I'm doing within my control and within my influence. Now, with this title, as much as I'd love to break into a rendition of Karma Chameleon, this is not a dedicated Boy George space right now, but I have launched a culture club in my organisation. The biggest barrier that I saw coming into my role is people not feeling comfortable and just shying away and feeling awkward from talking about race and racism and white skin privilege because they're scared they'll say something wrong. Now, I don't have control over an entire workplace that is unable to address the big issues like racism, but I had the ability to start a conversation and create a space that could potentially continue that conversation. So I launched Culture Club. I'm lucky enough to have a brilliant team, including a member of staff who's a former teacher from a global majority background, who wanted to just jump straight into this. So they developed the starting block, Talking Race in a Safe Space workshop. It looked at the history of the language and terminologies that we use today. It gave context, including a really powerful and impactful use of WAME instead of BAME, and the lack of nuance that applies, and she referred to the group as WAME, well, your WAME group, and asked how that made the group feel, and really dug into that. Then we looked at remediation. So you've said or done something that has upset someone, that has caused harm. Whether intentionally or not, harm was caused. Intention is not more important than the impact. So now what? We spoke about accountability. We spoke about sincerity in apology, in focusing on the learning and doing better. Then I managed to get a few hundred pounds from the wellbeing budget to buy a collection of books to launch the Anti-Racism and EDI library. This sits in our office on a bookshelf, and the books are available for any and all to borrow and read at any time. Very closely connected to that is the book and film club that meet once a month to discuss a particular book on a subject, film, podcast as well, or a particular issue that sparks conversation with the issues at hand within racism. Without having to draw on the trauma of people with lived experience in the group. That was a really kind of key priority for that. And there's also social events planned, like visits, art exhibitions, TEDx talks, etc. So I was able to start conversation. I'm in a position where I could establish something like that, and it was in my control. It's something relatively small. We're only a small office in the grand scheme of things, but people are feeling comfortable being uncomfortable now. They're taking small bites on their own anti-racism journey, and that is making ripples in the wider organisation. So we know anti-racism isn't going to happen simply because it's written down somewhere in a plan. It requires action. But that doesn't just need to be small actions, big actions, sorry. Small actions are fundamental. So I want to set you a challenge. Do something small today, this week. Take action. Turn the TV off 10 minutes earlier and read a few pages of that book that you've had sat there but are too scared to open. Switch the music off and listen to a podcast when you're driving or cooking. If you're feeling brave, write a few objectives down of what you want to achieve in this space personally. Write down how this makes you feel, if you're scared, if you're worried, if you're in pain. Racism is in all of us and nobody is perfect, but take it one step at a time. Each of us has to take those little steps to unlearn. Taking race equity seriously isn't just grandeur, it's you. It's the little things every single day. So start making ripples. Thank you.
So Amajit, over to you. When we have questions when you finish.
Thanks very much, Fidel. I'm just going to take over the screen, so just bear with me. And shortly you will see, hopefully, if you could just give me a verbal. Can you see the front cover of my presentation?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay. Following on from Fidel's introduction and Charlotte's really really fantastically impassioned input. There's a lot of things that resonate, but what I'll try to do is go through this at fairly whistle-stop speed and try not to duplicate some of the things that you've heard already before. Part of the work that we do emerged during the period before COVID. And one of the things we were very, very keen to do was identify a really, really positive narrative around a really tough subject. As you've already heard, the statistics are start, the lived experience are start. So we coined the phrase making the most of. How do we make the most of an ethnically diverse Britain? And this is a little bit about us, but I'm not going to labour effectively the notion of the Black Leadership Group, but more significantly are our beliefs. So on the screen, we believe that anti-racism is underpinned by a belief that every individual has the right to live a fulfilling life. For so long as any sort of systemic racism exists, it stunts people's potential, and anti-racist education helps people to define and challenge themselves, widen their experience. And finally, an anti-racist HE system unlocks the potential of all individuals and organizations and communities. And one of the things that we wanted to bring home is that post-Brexit Britain operates in a global ecosystem on demographical change, and particularly demographic mobility. And I love the website Our World in Data, because this is something that people are familiar with, which is up until this year, China was the most populous nation. It's been overtaken just this year by India, and the continent of Africa will overtake both of them in the coming years. And the fastest continent growing at the moment is the South Africa. Now, how does that play out for us in Europe? The more concentrated colours that you see here are the fastest growing areas in continental Europe, and the way and ethnicity is driving those increases. And this is how it plays out in post-Brexit Britain. So you've got a 2016 and 2061 ethnicity heat map, which has been prepared by the University of Leeds. And there's two simple conclusions you can draw from the colours that you see there, which is those areas in Britain that are ethnically concentrated will become even more ethnically concentrated, and those areas hitherto that have not encountered ethnic diversity will encounter that. And that's where I applaud Wales and their planning and their preparation and their resolve to nurture the opportunities of that. In other words, it's baked in, it's inevitable that all parts of Britain will become more ethnically diverse. And the UK population growth over the next 2.5 decades is undoubtedly driven by the growth in ethnic groups, including people of mixed heritage. And that affords huge opportunities to UK PLC. So WPP, the marketing advertising company, have sort of put together some key facts, which is by 2061, over a quarter of the UK adult population will come from ethnic minority groups. And I won't read the super numbers that you can see there in the context of the disposable incomes and the contributions that they will have. I'm sure people are familiar with the McKinsey research, which identifies, above all characteristics, ethnic diversity makes the greatest contribution to increase productivity, performance, and profitability in companies, 35% increase. At the same time, the McGregor-Smith review identified there are leakages of lost potential within that UK element, and that was quantified to the tune of £24 billion of lost potential per annum, which is only going to grow. So how does that play in, for example, the education system? This looks like an appallingly complicated chart. It's really simple. So if you look at the dotted line, that alludes to white British children's performance in state schools in England, and all the other lines reflect different ethnic groups. And the overriding point of this is the quality is there. So people from ethnic minority groups do well in primary school, do well in secondary school, and then something starts to tail off universally for people from ethnic minority backgrounds. It's important and noteworthy that, for example, Chinese, Indian, people from mixed heritage groups consistently still do better than their counterparts, but there's also the flip side of that. So the potential is absolutely there because ethnic minority groups do well. The second element is aspiration, and this trend chart identifies by the end of this decade, 2030, 1 in 3 of undergraduates in UK universities will come from Black and minority ethnic groups. So aspirations there. And also the notion of wanting to aspire to the best. This may look like an opaque chart, but it's actually quite an alarming, desperate chart, which is if you are Black and minority ethnic, as recently as 21, you had less chance getting into a Russell Group institution. And in 21, in every Russell Group institution, there was a higher offer rate to white British students than there were to Black students. And there's a research, as Fidel eloquently identified, which I'm not going to duplicate for the reasons of that. It's about the lived experience. Some of those issues are institutional, some of those are professional. One important thing is they extend not just from the student experience, but to the staff experience as well. And that's also reflected by the figures. This is information from the Office for Students, which identifies that Black and minority ethnic students are less likely to complete their studies at university. They're less likely to attain, and there's still gaps of 20 and 30%. Would you believe it? In a university that has over 75% of its student cohort is Black, there's still an attainment gap of over 30% for Black students. The other thing that the research identifies is that your degree classification, if you're from Black and minority ethnic groups, is likely to be lower. You're less likely to get a first or upper class, second class. Employment rates, irrespective of your qualification, if you are white, you're more likely to get a good job, with the notable exception of jobs where no qualifications are required. And over a generation of post-graduation, 1, 3, 5, and 10 years after graduation, if you are African, if you're Caribbean, Bangladeshi, or Pakistani descent, you earn less than your peers over that period. And in the context of workforce, what you can see here is effectively that the student cohort, that's the dotted line, is rapidly reaching 1 in 3 in university sector. And sadly, the representation in the context of academic staff, governors, middle managers, professors, etc., is sadly lagging behind. If that isn't enough, Ipsos did some future gazing and identified the 10 mega trends that are going to affect our world going forward. Those are the blue statements. But research identifies, and we've got huge amount that we've gathered at the Black Leadership Group, identifies whether it's increased inequalities, automation, including AI, the post-pandemic impacts. People have spoken about that in the context of household income, demographic change, and indeed climate change. There is a disproportionate effect based on your ethnicity. So these things are not going to go away, and actually the disparities may largen over a period of time. So what's the solution? I really like this piece of thinking from the National Endowment for Science and Technology, the Arts, NESTA. If you go to their website, they identify the 20 skills, abilities and knowledge which are going to be the striking difference in being able to really thrive in a 21st century world. If you'll notice, the emphasis on fluency of ideas, originality, deductive reasoning, and even active listening actually demands really an increased competency in cultural competence. So in the bottom right-hand corner there, we at BLG are sort of proposing a framework for a modern day curriculum, including leadership development. So the usual suspects of communication, collaboration, etc. But cultural competence is a key skill. And the penny dropped for me that applies to everyone when I was CEO and principal of one of the largest colleges in England, in Cornwall, where approaching 99% of the population is white. And I was responsible for 30,000 students from my institution, where inevitably a large proportion were going to have to leave Cornwall. And I felt there was a potential neglect of duty of my institution, not preparing those white students for a more multicultural, ethnic diversity world. And that's why anti-racism and cultural competence actually applies to everyone and benefits to everyone, in my opinion. So over the last 3 years, the Black Leadership Group have identified a transcript for some of the things that Charlotte was talking about: organizational, culture change, behavioral change, and things which are going to make a sustained difference, not simply a box ticking exercise. So our 10-point plan presents the notion of a framework of the 4 C's there, which is about curriculum, culture, the climate of organizations, and communication. And you can see the 10 points, which are effectively the key actions and targets and behaviors. I'll come to that in a bit more detail, that we have sought to support organizations with regards to their anti-racist journey. To help that, we've developed a higher education toolkit, which we call HEART, because it's not just about targets, in our opinion, it's about hearts and minds. And that's really, really fundamental. This is just an example of how the diagnostic toolkit probes and enables, challenges, educates organizations to really look at the implications of an increasingly ethnic diverse society, as it refers to. We've mapped out from research and best practice what great anti-racism behavior looks like. Again, Charlotte spoke about the importance of behavior. We think the SALT acronym that comes from there, if you've got time, just read the Association of SALT and the journey of racism over 400 years. But more pointedly, we think great anti-racism is shared, ambitious, lively, and true. And we work with organizations to profile their organization, their teams, and individuals in leaders against that framework. There's a flip side to that, which we call the inverse SALT framework, or bad day anti-racism behaviors, which permeate in organizational as well as team and individual behavior. You'll notice there's a subtle change to the SALT acronym. So bad anti-racism is separate, it's aggressive, it's loose and tetchy. And those behaviors are things we ask people to, taking Charlotte's point, confront themselves with and through in order to make that journey through their cultural journey. All of that is carrot. We believe there's an element of stick that's also required, because despite many, many initiatives in higher education, there's been very little progress. And these two little circles identify how higher education sits at the moment for BAME and for Black students. So a third of the students in the higher education system are BAME, but you can see the profile of academics and professors and governors, etc., sadly lag behind. And it's even more stark for Black students. So we believe there's an element of stick, and through the work of one of our members, Professor David Mbar, who is a Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Arts of London, he has led the development of the Ethnic Representation Index, which ranks every university in England in the context of how they're progressing towards race equity. And this is just a little bit of a sample of the index. It outlines where every university is around a number of indicators which link into the profile of students against academics, around ethnicity pay gap reporting and attainment gaps, and the notion of their work in anti-racism. And from 3 years ago, we have started to develop a whole community of organizations who are working with us across the United Kingdom. We started at further education. You can see that's heavily dominated. Charlotte, you'll be delighted to know that we have 100% of all the further education institutions in Wales working with us, as well as the capital city colleges in Scotland and Northern Ireland. But we've also started to get private sector schools and voluntary sector organisations working with us. So that's a really rapid presentation, Fidel, with loads and loads of information, and I'll come out of effectively the slideshow just now. There we go.
Thank you very much. That's a lot of information, but I'm very sure people have been listening in and taking note. I see a few people have been very active on the chat, and I think Sonia was one of them. So Sonia, I mean, if you raise your hand, my colleagues might be able to unmute you, and you'll be able to, yes, you can switch on your camera and use your mic.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I was just interested that the first question I asked was about do you really think that organisations are truly on board with targets and cultural change? Because we've had targets and commitments to cultural change for many, many years. And I think what COVID disparities exposed and the BLM protests was that a lot of that work that people thought was getting done wasn't actually being done. And so I'm asking really, do you think anything's really changed, or are people still playing lip service to tick box exercises linked to doing the bare minimum around the Equalities Act?
So who wants to go first? Okay, so let's start with Charlotte, and then we go to Amajit. Because we have been speaking, we give you a break, Amajit, in case you want to have some water.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Sonia. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I did spot it in the chat, and I think that's where I was kind of eager to touch on today, is that everyone seems to get the first 2 points of order of change right. We get the targets, we get the EDI strategies, but the actual action lacks substance. I think it is still lip service in many ways, but it's not all negative, because in my world now, following Black Lives Matter and the pandemic, people seem to be coming into conversations now, and really the conversations are being had. And there's a lot of insight, and people raise, oh, what about this? Oh, I haven't thought about this before. And I felt more comfortable challenging people who I would potentially not have stepped in to challenge before, because I knew that their white fragility was just going to deconstruct the entire kind of effectiveness of a solution, of a kind of an issue. So I think within my organisation, I am aiming to make sure that it's not just tick box. And I think in Wales, as I mentioned, the context within Wales is slightly different. We've got it coming from the top. Within this space, it is being forced down that this is action, and this needs to be solved. So yeah, that's from kind of my perspective.
And if I can just follow on to that, Sonia, I think from an ethnicity perspective, the conception of EDI sponsored by the Equality Act has not helped by putting all the protected characteristics. It's in many cases either diluted or helped and enable people to fudge. You know, for example, there have been winners and losers during the period of the Equality Act, and ethnicity is certainly not one of them. You can see that Fidel's sort of data and others. So it does require, as I think Charlotte's alluding to, a real positive, sustained commitment. It requires resolve. And targets can form part of that, but only if you hold yourselves to account and measurable. And somehow they conveniently lost. You know, universities are going through something called the Race Equality Charter, and they get a gold award just for preparing the plan. Right, but actually the material data identifies nothing has changed. So this is resilience, it's meaningful, sustained action, it's heavy lifting, and it has to be, I think what you're alluding to, it has to be tangible. And I think tangibility is often lacking. And I dare say, I think you've identified something. There is now a real danger of anti-racism fatigue in organizations. They hope it will go away. They've ticked the box, and they can go, you know, back into their shells and so on. And that's why the data in the direction of travel means that they can't ignore it. You know, ethnicity is going to be one of the characteristics of the UK population.
Thank you, Amajit and Charlotte.
Thank you so much. Yeah, great, great support from you both. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was going to suggest, because I've seen a lot of sort of interactions in the chat, I think it might be easier or simpler to ask people if they want to say something to literally raise their hands, and you know, so at least when it will be okay. So Amna.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so no, actually, it's a comment rather, because I personally feel, and I have been working FIDEL as well on this project, and we do realize this, that at times the expectations of behavioral change, from dominant groups, at times it's the racialized communities who have to change their behaviors in order to be heard. So at times when we were doing this work, there's a lot of conversation around how racialized leaders, they tend to manage their behaviors. They tend to speak to whiteness in the institutions in order to be heard, and to perform a certain notion of what is acceptable in institutional setting. And then the problem equally is that the trust, as Phil was talking about, because it's not only about the trust towards the institutions. It's equally the communities they are representing, these leaders. They have to make sure that their community will trust them enough that they're not representing any white agenda behind it. So this is another issue. And then the third point, this is the last one, is the unpaid labor of representation. A lot of women, we were talking about during the interviews, they were talking about how they have to do a lot of representative work, and it's not paid at all, and it's quite unpaid work, and it's diversity work, which is Sarah Ahmad puts in her work as well. So what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of issues in this entire debate, but the change we are not able to see because it's rather the communities who are supposed to be heard, they are still being unheard, and that's the crux of it. But thank you.
Any comments, or do you want, for us to get Alice? I think I saw Alice raising a hand as well. So Alice, do you want to go next? Then we can maybe combine a few questions.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm just trying to see some glimmer in all these things that we try and do in sectors that are different. And this week being Refugee Week again, as we've seen, most universities have jumped into this bandwagon of refugee scholarships. And yet we see that there is a lot of things that are happening that are not influencing actually policies within the government. A colleague of mine, Victoria Okoye, did a research, I'm a geographer, and did a research on Black geographers, why there is less in Black women in geography and what is happening. And she came, or most of the things that were found in that research was that most of them either within their PhD, they drop because they found it very, very difficult. And at the same time, most of the Black women, as you know, come in and they have to do work and do all this, they don't get scholarships. So there's a struggle of even the younger generation dropping up in their PhD, as some of your statistics, Amrijit, has shown that there's no matter how much attainment get or resources we are putting in academic spaces, there's something that we're not getting right, and the labor remains with people of color that continuously try and advocate for this, but they are lesser in the spaces than anybody, and there's pushback in some ways. So the tick boxes are continuously happening. We see it in charities again. We see it in every space that is happening. And the future generation are going to still continue struggling in that, and less professors are going to be there, Black lecturers or Black academics, especially Black women in spaces like this, because it's so very difficult. So how do we combine all these kind of research that have been done from, I don't know, many, many years since, I mean, if you read books from America, from anybody, Bell has written a lot of books. How do we combine all these things to actually have action instead of just continuously researching and extracting information from people that are already struggling? And we want the practical solutions. We want things to change and influence whether it's government or universities or the people that have got the power to do the changes. That's the most important thing that I think can help even a future generation. Thank you.
Some great comments there, Alice, and really fundamental sort of questions. If I kick off, and then I'm sure colleagues will want to join in. I think there's no doubt sustained political commitment like that seen in Wales is really, really important. You've got a stable but also sustained commitment, which leads all the way to 2030. We saw progress in further education when we had that, but it's not been, I'm not making a political comment, it's not been in recent times in England. And therefore, and it's obviously more complicated with devolved, sort of government and so on, whatever. But there's no doubt in my mind, sustained political commitment where everyone, sort of covers that. That also follows through in the context of sustained institutional commitment. So the point that Charlotte made, that if it doesn't come from the top, you haven't got a cat in hell's chance in cover that. The other thing then is people have got to see tangibly that top changing. So, but it's not just the color and the hue of that representation, it's actually the values and the beliefs and the strategies. So you've got a paradox at the moment in the context of hostility to asylum seeker and being led by a Black Home Secretary. That's all I'm saying. So colour does not guarantee growth on this particular, so it's not just simply tokenistic. It has to be sort of covered there. There's a piece of research, which, interestingly, you may want to Google it, which is whenever Obama, during his tenure, raised the issue of race, his popularity rating went down. Right? So this really requires, that's a commitment. But alongside that, I think there are, sort of practical solutions that identify that they work. So I think a sustained, proactive focus on developing the pipeline of representation, starting the aspiration in the context of the first step in your career journey. I moved to principalship when I was satisfied. I thought I'd reach my threshold simply as a teacher, a lecturer of economics, and then someone proverbially tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're better than that." And they sponsored me, but I without doubt, it was the first step that opened the avenues in the context towards leadership, and I'm privileged to have led a number of institutions as a result of that. So the things about talent development, but I also think Amna said something really important, which is even with that, it can be a very lonely journey. And the instinct is to be the caricature of the majority, as opposed to the sense of belonging. So the final thing really is, and Fidel, in your slides, you mentioned the importance of belonging. There's a critical piece of work to do that you, in your individual characteristics, really belong, and you bring that into your decision making and your professionalism and so on. The reality is now, if you make a mistake at the top, if you're Black, it's less forgiving. Right, we've got absolutely anecdotal, but fairly substantive anecdotal research on that. Hope that helps or starts to help.
Charlotte, yeah.
That was brilliant. I was kind of just like, yeah, that was exactly what, just perfect responses. I think you mentioned belonging, and that's kind of the first word that I wrote down to Amna's comments. I think what I'm currently doing now, there was a joint equality strategy with South Wales Police that has just come to its end, and I said from the beginning that I wasn't going to be doing a joint. How am I supposed to hold the police to account when I'm doing in their equality objectives and in an unequal criminal justice system when I'm, you know, leading a joint equality strategy. So I said, we're having our own one as a commissioner's office. That was centering, with the centre objective being belonging. And as part of that, it's been a kind of the collective process. It's being led by the entire staff. And it crosses intersectionally then, because we've got members of staff who are queer, we've got members of staff who are neurodiverse, we've got racially minoritized members of staff that are shrinking themselves to fit into a white, cisgendered, hetero environment. And it's crushing people. It is, you cannot bring your whole authentic self, your entire cultural identity with you to work. And then how are we supposed to, we were supposed to be the voice of the public in what I do. How are we the voice of the public when we can't even be the voice of our own team? So that was a priority for us. And some of the things that we're looking at within that is around hair and headwear policies. So looking at hair discrimination, and the Halo Code has been a massive guidance for that, which is around Afro hair within the work environment. And policing in particular, it's very difficult to have those conversations with rigid uniform policies. So if I just touch around that sense of belonging, it's collective, and we need to kind of start from that ground. With regard to Alice's conversation around representation, I'm glad that Wales has had conversations and is having conversations around this as part of the Anti-Racism Wales Anti-Racism Action Plan, because they've got an entire section on education, including higher educational models. You're completely correct that political commitment is important, but there's a cycle that needs to be broken, that Alice alluded to, where you've got, and particularly looking at kind of schooling in general, you've got young people from global majority backgrounds not seeing themselves in those who are teaching them. They're then being bullied and racially bullied within their school environment, which is making schooling incredibly difficult, and they're not wanting to come back to that because they're not being represented, because they're then not being taught about their history within the background. And that's another thing that Welsh Government has been able to do, is implementing new Black history is Welsh history strategy that has come in, and has been a new curriculum that was launched last year as part of that, to break that cycle so that young people are seeing themselves in what they're being taught. And yeah, so very, very much interesting kind of perspectives that are coming out here, and it's as I said, one bite at a time, really, isn't it?
Okay, so I think we have time just for one last question, if there is any. Otherwise, I'll be asking for final comments from our speakers. I am taking away a few things. One is the belonging. You can't become what you can't see. And then the whole idea of becoming a caricature of the majority in order to fit in. I think that is very sad, but that's a reality. Any final questions from the audience? We've gone quiet? Okay. Yeah, see, there is another hand. Yes, I'm very sure. Yes, very shortly we'll be able to speak. Yes, go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you. Yeah, so really amazing content. Thank you, everyone. I just had a quick question. So I'm the co-chair of the anti-racism group in our national organization, and it's been a huge journey. We founded our group due to the incident with George Floyd, and we've been really rallying and doing lots of EDI work. But one of the things that we're really trying to work on, I wanted to know your thoughts around this, and if you know anything will be done with regards to research or any work later on in the future, is the mental health of people who have lived experiences, because we know some of our colleagues who face racism in the workplace and outside. You know, it's okay if you are able to speak to individuals at home, but when you know, how it affects your mental health, and if you are not able to access counselling services within the workplace or outside from an independent service like the NHS, independent GPs, etc., if they're not fully equipped to understand lived experiences in the trauma, again, I see that as another barrier. And I'm just wondering, have you had an opportunity to have discussions around this with any other organisations? What is your feedback? What are your thoughts? I'd be really grateful to hear.
I don't know.
Just go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So I think the first point there is it's really important to recognise those particular issues and those challenges and those problems. And I'm so pleased that you mentioned the word trauma as part of your commentary. So some progressive organisations that we're working with have inserted the lived experience of racism as part of trauma-informed practice in their institutions, and that immediately makes it mainstream as opposed to marginalised. One organisation that we're working with in West Yorkshire have actually put trauma-informed practice informed by anti-racism as part of one of their strategic priorities, because, as you will know, everyone, West Yorkshire is hyper diverse in its demographic profile. So this isn't a marginal sort of experience, it's actually a major experience. So the one thing is really embedding it, embracing it as an organisational sort of need and priority, form it as part of your central infrastructure, and then build in the skill sets, including the representation. Because coming back to Fidel's point, which I really was struck by about gatekeeping, what you'll find in a lot of organisations, public and private sector, HR, support functions and others are not representative and don't have that lived experience. So it's really important to inject, diversify those support functions and services and the leadership to legitimize, you know, this growing trend.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, we've even put forward a suggestion as a group that when, for example, someone is wanting to report something that they've experienced, that the person who's supporting the individual around that investigation, that needs to be a person of colour, and to provide that support, and there needs to be an aftercare package. And if we are supporting a counselling service that's linked to our organisation, it has to be counsellors, you know, who have an understanding of racism. It's just so important, because we know that when you have a lived experience of racism and the trauma, it's not just one-off. Anything could trigger it at any time in the future. So it's just, you know, we need to ensure, you know, we've got good mental health, and we've got that support.
Absolutely.
Charlotte, you wanted to say something, and then we round up. Because it is
Yeah,
90.
but just very quickly, if that's okay. That's, yeah, it's so important, Nadia, and I'm so pleased that you mentioned that you've already got some that those requirements in place. I think from my from what I can add to this is obviously within a policing element is that Criminal Justice in Wales Anti-Racism Action Plan has actually recognised that racial trauma within its work, and it's implementing a trauma-informed approach by trying and aiming to help the police recognise that when they are stop and searching or stop and accounting, there's a racially traumatized individual who, obviously we're talking about kind of the disproportionality of stop and search statistics. The police don't see that. They see that somebody who is looking scared and kind of worried must be doing something wrong and not in a traumatized position. So there's real conversations that need to be had around mental health within this space, as well as the disproportionality of racially minoritized individuals in mental health crisis being criminalized as well. So there's some really interesting work happening in policing space in Wales.
Majid, did you have any final words or?
No,
No,
I
thank
just
you.
put I've just put a little remark in there. Fidel, I loved your typology of gatekeeping and allyship and hard to reach. I'd love to learn more of that because that's really resonated in our work, and I'm sure we could sort of work together on that.
Yeah, so the paper on gatekeepers is more or less going out soon. So of course I'm happy to share, to write it if it helps. The one on allyship is ongoing, and probably we'll be doing some work around how to reach as well soon. But certainly happy to share the resources we have. I think I saw, is it Ibed? Do you want to say something? I know I'm conscious that we have gone beyond time, but obviously if people are hanging around, then it's okay. We can. I hope it is okay with Amajit and Charlotte.
Absolutely.
If I can just be very snappy quickly, I want to thank both speakers, but I thought I wanted to add my voice. You do know the work I do, and lived experience, it's very important, because when Charlotte started and she sort of said, what is the benefit of her lived experience, etc. I can understand if you have a long arm, but I think lived experience should never be undermined, because it allows you to understand the experience that you're dealing with or helping to deal with in a different view of feeling. Because literally, as the last speaker said, what they said about stop and account, it literally brought back trauma. And thinking about it. And I'm talking of probably the last time I was ever stopped and search, we would have called it at the time, it's about 25 years ago. But just listening to that just reminded me that my last interaction with police, which was about a year or something ago, didn't go well, really because police did not even understand. And I would give a quick context. It's dealing with somebody of a different race, obviously, who has just attacked me, but I wouldn't even feel comfortable defending myself. And I'm in my house, standing in front of my map, I'm thinking. And so when I went on 999, my first comment was, obviously, this has happened. They sort of said it wasn't the type of emergency, but I literally had to say, I'm a Black guy. If I defend myself, I'm going to be the guy being arrested first. And that prompted a different response from the dispatcher. Effectively, police turned up, and guess what? I was being told off. And I recorded it and said, I think, Charlotte, when I had a meeting with you last time, I didn't feel comfortable to even join your accountability. And that's nothing to do with you, because you are actually from the Police and Crime Commissioner. But that, even with 30 years of working in the community and working with organizations, that has literally scared me in thinking, what was the point of me even calling? And that traumatizes you because you feel like you can't even get out. Because I know, and I've lived the experience of being stopped or being dealt with simply because of my race. And you think, okay, I now have knowledge, insight, etc. How do I deal with it? Okay, call the police. Don't defend yourself. Don't be in a position to fall into the stereotypical aggressive Black man sort of situation. And it does. That trauma stays with you, because at the point where I'm trying to protect my child and partner, for example, I still feel like I shouldn't have even made that phone call. And that individual didn't have the appreciation of my reaction at that point was not just based on the event that is happening now. Just like any other PTSD that would have been taken into consideration, the racial what was the word I'm going to use? The impact of racism has never quite been studied in a way to accept what I call post-slavery traumatic disorder. I think other people have used that as well. So if I had any physical trauma in the past, that would affect myself, and there's a likelihood that there's scientific evidence to say that that PTSD can affect the way I deal with family, etc., etc. The same way, post-slavery traumatic incidents have carried on from generation to generations, but never really have been examined via the medical lens or the psychological lens to say that why do our young people end up in the justice system that much? It's not just institutional racism, but it's the fact that, as the previous speaker said, mental health, post-traumatic stress disorder, etc., are not looked in with a view to racial impact. Thank you.
I couldn't have captured that more eloquently than you did, and all I can say is that you're absolutely correct, and you have to. I think allyship is part of it, and Charlotte's a great example of allyship and advocacy. But there is another dimension, if Charlotte doesn't mind me saying, that you have to have lived it, because just as you spoke, I live in Cornwall now because my family wouldn't let me leave Cornwall. So I have a child in school, and I was devastated. It brought back all the trauma when I learned my child encountered in the past year instances of racism. You hoped it goes away, especially for the next generation and so on. And as David Mbar says, one of the drivers for him preparing the ethnicity representation index, the name and shaming, was a quote, "What do you say to your daughter applying to university when she says, should I apply to that establishment? What do you think? What do you know, Dad?" And he had all the data at his fingertips, and that identifies, you know, the inevitability of some of those challenges, and that's lived experience.
That note, Ian, did you want to say something? I've seen you have been typing messages and so forth. I don't want to. Ian, are you still here? Okay, so we can do it offline. So thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you also to all our sort of the contributors from the audience, as well as people who sat along and joined us for nearly 2 hours. It was a great pleasure, and I hope you got something out of this one here. Certainly I learned a lot, and there'll be a few things to follow up, including Gilbert. Maybe next time around we may ask him to come and tell us more, maybe facilitate and give a presentation on this, how an experience of 20-something years ago still resonates with him today. I think that's something, a message we need certainly to share with the powers that be. And from my side, we had a great team to help us behind the scenes and in organizing and doing everything. That's Louise, Claire, and Sam from her team, as well as Claire, who is doing an internship with the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership, and all my colleagues here in the room who have decided not to say a word, although I'm very sure they have a lot to say. So thank you very much, and watch this space. I hope you have joined the CVSL mailing list. If you haven't, that's fine. You'll be kept aware of what we are doing in terms of research, in terms of knowledge exchange, in terms of teaching. This is our final webinar for the academic year. But guess what? The academic year starts in August. So we will certainly be keeping you posted about what we are doing and we're getting more colleagues to come and share what we are doing, because I can tell you we have got great work happening within the business school at the Open University, and I don't want to be the one listening to those stories alone. I want those stories to be shared across the board. So we know, you know where we are. Keep in touch, and thank you very much for everything.
Yeah.
And bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.